Welcome to Close Up with Sam Taylor. I'm here with Kelly Linville, Mayor-elect of Bellingham. Kelly, welcome to the program. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for inviting me, Sam.
You're welcome. So, wanted to talk to you a little bit. There's been a lot happening recently, and now that you're apparently rested from a vacation, let's talk a little bit about kind of the election overall. Maybe let's take a little bit further back from that. Last time you and I spoke, I was a reporter with the Bellingham Herald, and it was after November 2010, a pretty heated election, one that there was some disappointment there. And you and I had spoke on the record for an interview kind of about that and kind of dealing with those types of things. And at the time, you weren't very pleased. Maybe that's an understatement, a little bit of laughter there. I was hoping maybe you could recount that a little bit for us now, kind of how you were feeling then, and maybe in comparison to this election cycle, which was also pretty heated.
Well, in 2010, of course, I was in a different position. I was an incumbent, and the election went to a hand recount. It was an automatic recount, and I didn't know until almost December if I'd actually won the election or not. So it was very drawn out, and it's always disappointing to lose an election, especially if you are an incumbent legislator. So I was extremely disappointed at the time, but I had been in the legislature for 17 years and had actually been weighing whether I actually wanted to run for re-election or not. So I always try to make a lemonade out of lemons, and so when I was approached to run for mayor, I had to think about it a really long time because I had just been through a very tough election and knew this one would be too, running against an incumbent. And yet I was very excited about a new challenge, so I think I put more energy and more passion into my mayor's race. And I'm glad, even though it was close, it turned out the way it did. So obviously, on election night, I was a much happier camper than I'd been a year before.
Do you think that you've kind of, I guess, dealt with some of those emotions you had from there? Part of what the discussion you and I had previously was kind of, I think, some disappointment in perhaps the voters in the 42nd, especially the more conservative areas, where you felt like you had represented them well, and then they decided to not support you in that election. Are you kind of over that at this point?
Well, absolutely, because the truth is, I always did what I thought was right, and I am very socially progressive. I'm fairly fiscally moderate or conservative. So I always did what I thought was right, and in really hard economic times, especially if you're the Ways and Means chair, whether it's all your fault or not all your fault, you get the responsibility for decisions that get made. So we raise taxes, we cut things like education. It was a very difficult time in a bad economy, but there was nothing that no way I had voted or anything I had done that I would have done differently. And so even though I was disappointed that some of the people that I thought that I'd represented well weren't there for me when I needed them, I definitely understood why. And once I was away from the election, that's when I came to terms with the fact that it wouldn't have made any difference. I wouldn't have voted anyway or done anything just to win my election. So I was at peace with that.
Gotcha. Now, moving forward to another heated election now here in 2011, it was different this time because you had factions seemingly of one party. And everyone, who's aware of the kind of the system here knows that the Democratic Party in Whatcom County is very diverse, has a lot of different terms. We have the unions and the environmentalists, and that seems to be kind of how this election went. And while I believe you were very well supported in the legislature by environmentalists very often, this time it was different. And how did you deal with that throughout the election cycle?
Well, I believe that both Dan and I, were Democrats and had many of the same environmental principles. So personally, I would have thought that the conservation voters, some of the other environmental groups, would do fine with either one of us. And I was a little surprised when they only endorsed Dan. But of course, he was the incumbent. So I was okay with that. But I was a little surprised and disappointed that they didn't just support their candidate. They had to try to discredit me. And I didn't think that that was probably necessary, though that's the way campaigns are now. And truthfully, I'm glad it didn't work.
Now, I think I've heard some, I don't know if it's rumor, maybe you can correct this, so that's why I'm asking, but I've heard that they may have approached you, some of those environmental groups, and asked you not to run, and said that if you did run, that they would treat you like a perhaps more Republican or conservative opponent. And I'm wondering if that's true.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I was told by one of their activists that if I ran for county executive, at the time Pete was still running, but if I ran for county executive, I'd have their support. But if I ran for mayor, not only would they not support me, they would actively work against me. And the truth is, I thought people should should have an option and a choice. And partly because of how the election turned out, I think that was probably correct, because there were a lot of people that were dissatisfied with the current leadership, and there were a lot of people that supported Mayor Pike. But in the end, I think it was fair to let the voters have a choice and decide.
Gotcha. Now, the biggest part and the biggest aspect of that election around the environmental aspects, obviously, was the Gateway Pacific Terminal project. And there was a lot of media coverage about whether or not there were accurate statements and what your position was on that. You look at your Q&A in the Bellingham Herald, and the very first sentence in your answer regarding that project is, "I do not support a coal terminal specific project at that site." And you know, you and I have spoken about that prior to that even. That's your position. And how difficult was it for you to get that out there?
Well, I think it wouldn't have been so difficult to get it out there if I hadn't had a competing message that had a lot of money behind it. Because I usually am very direct and just say what I think. Sometimes that's not real political. But once I said what I thought, then I guess I would have thought maybe someone would have said, "Oh, well, I didn't quite understand what she said at first, and this is a clarification." But it never was a clarification, and up until the weekend before the election, there was information that was going out that was misrepresenting my position. I still feel exactly the same way I did before. I won't approach this any differently than I would have if this hadn't been a very central issue in the campaign, because I'm very clear about the fact that exporting coal is not a good trade policy, just because if we're dependent on one commodity at Cherry Point, the economy is going to change, and we need to make sure that we can export a multitude of products from up here if it's built, and I think that would be very difficult if coal is one of the commodities. But we didn't get to have a more intellectual conversation about that issue. It got very emotional, very fast, and when that happens, it's really hard to get people to kind of settle back down and just look at facts.
Now, we obviously had those simmering emotions during the election, afterward, and have you had any conversations or have you met with any of those groups that opposed you during the election to discuss those issues?
I really haven't met with any groups. I have spent a lot of time this past week talking to department heads in the city of Bellingham about specific projects that are on the city's plate, and just to help get me up to speed before January 1st. And the mayor and David Webster have been very gracious in providing a transition opportunity for me, setting up appointments and making staff available so that we can get to know each other before the first day I walk in the door, and I appreciate that.
Do you feel like there will be time within the next year where you will sit down with some of those groups or have those discussions about what your position is and how you can work together? You know, that was the discussion you had, was trying to work together as...
Right. My goal is to have a city conversation about this, starting with all the facts, all the options. If the city council wants to take a position on this, so that we all speak with one voice, I think that would be good. But I just want to make sure all the facts are out there before the mayor himself or herself leads the charge. And the people that set the policy for the city are the city council. And the awareness was raised very high because of the advocacy that the mayor demonstrated. But the policy position has to be developed by the city council, and I'm willing to help them listen to all the voices and have a very thorough discussion of the issue if they believe they need to take a position. Right now, their position has been to basically enumerate the potential impacts and the mitigation that they'd like to see, and the fact that they'd like to be a part of the overall scope in EIS.
Now we've kind of discussed a little bit about something that you have argued, and it seems pretty clear you've argued is a similar position with the mayor in terms of what should be exported. Were there any issues, because it seemed difficult for me to sometimes discern, were there any issues where you felt like you actually did diverge from Mayor Pike in the election?
Well, definitely the red light camera. Mm-hmm. I think there's essential services of government, and I think public safety is one of them. And I personally do not support privatizing public safety services for profit. I think that's something that the city should provide. At a minimum, I believe that we should have been very straightforward that that there was both a revenue and a safety concern, not just a safety concern, because I think that the red light camera recommendations came out of the FAST task force, which was a financial task force, not a safety task force. And I also think that the mayor was very premature in signing a contract that now leaves the citizens in limbo, because I'm sure there are a lot of people, well, there are about 68%, I think, that did not support the red light camera policy. And I don't think that every single one of them understand that their vote became advisory because the mayor signed a contract that allowed the company to sue us prior to being harmed. So prior to anyone getting a ticket, the company could intervene and sue. In the other communities across the state, somebody had to get a ticket first and then sue. So we were at a real disadvantage once that contract was signed, and we still are, because unless there's some way to negotiate with the company, and there's no reason for them to negotiate with us now, those cameras are scheduled to go up. Mm-hmm. I think there are going to be a lot of surprised citizens about that. They're going to be very angry, and they're going to come and talk to me.
Well, there were a lot of issues that people were concerned about during the election. We happen to have a package that we'd like to show you now regarding some of those issues and concerns that we ran on election night.
Honestly, I think that the most important issue to me is who gets elected to the county council.
Downtown development. Same as everywhere else in the country, which is the economy. So things like the coal port and stuff like that.
Water quality and protecting Lake Waka watersheds.
So do you know who you're going to vote for?
I'm going to vote for Dan Pike, very proudly.
I'd like to see Kelly Linville win.
I don't know who I'm voting for sheriff yet.
I've been going back and forth a lot between the two. I think I'm leaning towards Dan Pike, but I'm still not sure.
How do you feel about the hard alcohol initiative?
Oh, I'm voting against that.
I'm voting to not allow hard alcohol in Costco.
My husband is against it. I voted for it. Yeah, I think there are good arguments on both sides. I think that's a difficult issue.
How do you feel about the red light initiative?
Oh, I don't care.
I'm sort of neutral about that. I voted against it, but I don't know. I'm still kind of in my heart on the fence.
No, I don't want them.
No.
I don't like red light cameras.
Welcome back to Close Up. I'm still here with Mayor-elect Kelly Linville from the city of Bellingham. Kelly, I wanted to chat with you a little bit still about the red light camera issue, because I know your position is let's not privatize this. This is a priority for the city of Bellingham and the community. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we're still hurting in the budget, and do we have the money in the budget for more police to police these intersections, or what is a solution in your mind moving forward in your administration to dealing with these types of safety issues and revenue issues?
Well, when I've met with the department heads, one of the things I've said is every single service the city provides is not equally important. And this is a mantra I had at the state level too. But I didn't write the original budget, so we always worked off the governor's budget or someone else's budget. I'm going to be reducing staff in the mayor's office. we are going to look at how we reduce the amount of talking that we do about what we're going to accomplish and put more direct service on the ground, because I think we can. So there are a lot of issues that are unfunded liabilities in this budget. It's very frustrating to have heard over and over and over during the campaign, up until after the campaign, that we have a balanced budget. We do not. And so whether or not we needed more police officers now, we have other things that we need to fund, and we have to have a long-term strategy to figure out how to do that. One of the ways you do that, and the economy is starting to uptick, is to generate more revenue. We have empty storefronts. We have a high turnover of small businesses downtown. We have big box stores empty on Meridian. And we need to decide how we can attract or maintain the businesses we have, basically, and I think you'll appreciate that, so they don't go north to Ferndale. And we need to examine that, and I've heard a strong commitment from the staff in Bellingham to examine that, to examine our permitting system, to look at our regulations, and to figure out how we do generate the revenue that we need for our essential services. But we have a few big budget holes in environmental cleanup, in purchases of property, in pension funds, unfunded pension liabilities. There are some multi-million dollars worth of liabilities that we are going to have to deal with over time, and that means we have to have a plan. So we have to have a spending plan, we have to have a revenue plan, and we have to have a streamlining plan of our services so that we can balance our budget, and it's going to be difficult. I am not necessarily a fan of continuing just to raise taxes on the people that are still here, mostly businesses.
You talk a little bit about the issues, but stepping back a little bit, sometimes it's, and maybe it's a cheesy thing, but oftentimes politicians, or especially executives, like to set forth a 100-day plan, so to speak. And do you have one of those? Obviously, you've been meeting with people.
I actually have, I'm going to propose a 60-day status assessment, because I don't think that I could propose a 100-day plan until I know exactly what the status of the city is, whether it's revenues, uncompleted projects, contracts that need to be negotiated. So I'm going to take 60 days to make sure that I have a good grasp of where the city is now. I'm going to report that to the citizens of Bellingham with some first steps in what we're going to do. But 100-day plans many times are precipitous. You say, okay, in the first 100 days, I'm going to do this, but you really haven't had time to work the details through, and you can many times adopt things that if you had waited a little bit longer, had a little bit more information, you would have made a different decision. And I think that we have contracts that we've negotiated and signed. We've had purchases of property that we've made. We've had cleanups that we have taken on that we didn't do enough homework up front. And so I can't come out there and say in the first 100 days I'm going to do anything specific. I can tell you that one of the first things I'm going to start, though, is to look at our library system. We have an adopted plan about our library. It was adopted several years ago. I think Tim Douglas was the chair of the committee when that happened. And then for the last 4 years, we've considered other locations. I think that we need to look at some of our existing processes and bring them to a close. So we have a library there. We have a sub-area plan for the waterfront that needs to come forward. So the Planning Commission can start picking it apart. We have contracts to continue to negotiate with the largest union in Bellingham, AFSCME 114, and the police department. And then we have to figure out how to pay for Chuckanut Ridge too. So we need to look at the status of where we are, and then in 60 days I'll have a 100-day plan, but I'm not going to start the first day. I think it would be a little impulsive to do that.
And you talk about Chuckanut Ridge. that's something that concerned you from the get-go, and you've highlighted that throughout the campaign. Do you have any ideas of where we're going to get the money? Obviously they've committed some funding, and you feel like that's inappropriate. Are there other options?
Well, right now, if you talk to the finance director, Chuckanut Ridge is paid for because if there isn't an alternative funding source, it comes out of Greenway 3. That means that we spend the Greenways 3 money that was designated for the whole city on one project, which I don't think the citizens really supported. So in essence, it's paid for, but is that the appropriate way to pay for it? We have 6 years to decide. I would prefer not paying interest on a loan for 6 years. So I think we need to look at the zoning. Was the 700 and some units an appropriate level of zoning for that piece of property? And then if we can't easily find a way to pay for it, I think that we need to look at selling enough of the property that's rezoned that can be developed for sure, so that we can pay back at least the part of the purchase price that we borrowed. And I know people won't be happy with that, so I challenge them to come up with a better idea. But I don't think anybody would want to consider purchasing that property now with the zoning and the history that it has. I don't think we would find anybody who would want it.
Let's talk about the waterfront a little bit.
Okay.
That was also on your mind deeply during the election, and you felt like there was a lack of movement there. We did see in other media, and I'll shout out to John Stark, who did talk to Department of Ecology and other agencies who felt like this is how the process works. And how do you feel about that, and where do we go from here?
Well, I've met, I had breakfast with one of the port commissioners this morning. I'm meeting with Charlie Sheldon, the director, and staff later in the week, next week. There was a breakdown in communication. We had a period in which there wasn't direct communication between the director of the port and the mayor of the city. And there has been some movement, but I think we would have been a little bit farther along if we hadn't had that pause. I also met with the Public Development Authority, and that is the body that was put in place to look for investment for the waterfront. Until we have a sub-area plan, it's pretty hard to bring people in and say we'd like you to invest on our waterfront project, because we haven't come to an agreement on what the level of development is going to be. And that's going to change from what we originally determined, which was like 6 million feet of development. I don't think that that's square feet. I don't think that's going to be our near or short-term or near-term goal, potentially not a long-term goal. So we're going to have to revisit what's appropriate to be down there, and do we start at the waterfront or do we start partially in downtown, so that we don't again skip over the downtown as we did with Bellis Fair. We have a lot of land that can be redeveloped within the already existing developed core, and I think that we need to have a priority for that too.
So it sounds like, though, that we might have a little bit more of a pause again, because you feel like there needs to be a reassessment there.
No, I think that we should move forward. A year ago, we could have sent the sub-area plan to the Planning Commission. I'm saying don't pause anymore. I'm saying send that plan forward so that we can begin the discussion. That plan is not going to be adopted as is. Basically, there are agreements about how we're going to proceed that we're discussing now that have been worked on for about a year. But we need, I don't want to pause it, I want to start it. And we've had a year delay.
In terms of the amount of square footage, and that's part of this aspect, do you feel like that's too much? Do you feel like in the current economic time we need to be, is there a more realistic approach perhaps? Or
I think there is, because I don't think that we really considered how you're going to pay for it, what kind of infrastructure, exactly who is going to pay for what. How much is the private sector going to be a partner in this? There are people who still believe that the whole site should be publicly owned. That wasn't the position that the port took. So those are the kind of things that will come out of the sub-area plan, and then the Public Development Authority can start doing their work. So I guess what I believe is that we need some light industrial presence down there. We need some truly water-dependent uses, like the lease that the port just signed with the company that is manufacturing in Ferndale now, of course, but needs a port up here to export from. So maybe that will be something that generates some revenue. I hear a little like a ticking bomb in the back of my mind, which is the $25 million that we have 18 months to match. Well, we're not going to be able to match $25 million in 18 months, so we need to start with something so that the state, in their horrible economic crisis, doesn't decide that that money isn't available to us anymore.
Talking about another waterfront, Lake Whatcom, a big topic and one of your passions, I think, for years. There's a lot of debate on Lake Whatcom about where to go from here, and you participate in that in the election in terms of kind of a reassessment again of what our priorities are, land purchases, educational campaigns. In your discussions with department heads and staff, where do we go from here on Lake Whatcom?
Well, I haven't had my Lake Whatcom briefing yet, but I've been approached now by the Whatcom Water and Sewer District and the new county executive to say we need to get back together as a group and all take responsibility for what happens at Lake Whatcom. We need to take responsibility for the built environment that we have that is still polluting the lake. And we have to partner, I believe, with the county and the sewer water district on any kind of land purchases or anything that's outside our city limits. I don't think it's the city's total responsibility to take that on. I think that it's a shared responsibility because we all have jurisdiction on the lake. And Jack Laus is very anxious to start that discussion, and the Lake Whatcom Sewer and Water District said, congratulated me on my election and said, can we start our talks again? So I think that there is a desire to see if we can kind of reboot a team rather than Bellingham just going it alone.
Speaking of that team, how do you feel that relationship with Jack Laus is going to be moving forward in that county relationship?
Well, I worked with Jack the whole 8 to 12 years. I can't remember how long he was the mayor of Linden. And I have known him a very long time because his dad and my husband were freeholders that wrote the county charter. And John, Jack's dad, was the first county executive, and my husband was on the first county council. So we have known each other for a long time. And Will and I are friends of Jack and Cindy's. We actually had our first meeting together today on a different topic because there was someone who wanted to make a presentation to Jack and me, and I said, well, why don't we do it together? So we did. And we had a little disagreement during the meeting, but we've disagreed already. I mean, we've already disagreed. We already know how to discuss with each other. And the really great thing about both of us, I think, is it's not personal if we disagree. But I find that we are both fairly public purpose-minded. So it's what's best for the public, and we're going to try to move forward together. And we've made that commitment to each other. And I believe it's going to work. Because it doesn't do any good for the county and the city to be at odds. It does no good for the port and the city to be at odds. And we're going to change those relationships. And I've heard very positive comments from staff, from council members, from Jack, that we want to see this work differently. And I'm excited about that.
Sounds like an exciting time moving forward into January. Mayor-elect Linville, I want to thank you very much for being here. Thank you as well, audience, for participating in another show with us. This has been Close Up with Sam Taylor. Have a great evening.